The fact is that if you're going to be using vSphere 5.1 or vSphere 5.5, then you're going to be using single sign-on. It's part of the initial installation. When you do the installation, you create vSphere.local domain. And the very first administrator at vSphere.local, is an important account. You set a password on that account, and you better remember it, because everyone authenticates to single sign-on, not to Active Directory or some other type of centralized authentication. vSphere has its own centralized authentication now. And that's the biggest difference, is that instead of users, which really that's a bad terminology. When you think of users, you probably think of end users. And when we talk about vSphere, of course we're not talking about end users, because end users would be oblivious to the fact that we were actually providing their server as a virtual machine. So when we talk about users and groups here, we're actually talking about other administrators. You can see I set up an admin 01. I'll show you later on how I did that. But the main point that I want to make here is that vSphere.local is its own domain. So the system is authenticating itself. In other words, it's providing its own authentication mechanism. If we click on the Configuration tab and let that paint, then you can take a look. We've got password policies, we've got lockout policies, token policies, things that we'll take a look at in greater depth in just a little while. But I wanted you to see that the single sign-on service is its own authentication domain. Now, there are multiple parts that go into providing the single sign-on service. And so what I want to do now is go out to PowerPoint for just a second, and let's take a look at those parts. First of all, there's the single sign-on administrative server itself. That's what allows me to look at those users and groups, right? Users being other admins, junior admins, people that work for you and actually do administration on the system. And then groups of people like that I can manage who has access for administrative control of vCenter. So the single sign-on administrative server gives me that capability to manage those groups and users. Then there's the security token service. The security token service allows me to be able to authenticate one time as an administrative user and be able to then use that authentication to log on to multiple tools. Used to be that an administrator might have to log off and then log on again in order to change tools. And in other words, in order to use, for example, Site Recovery Manager or vCenter Operations Manager instead of vCenter Server. And that's kind of crazy because those are all VMware tools. But what if, as an administrator, I could log on once, and that takes care of my authentication, and then my authorization is provided by whatever tool that I want to access after that. So the security token service allows for multiple access, and I'll show you how that works when we talk about the infrastructure in just a minute. The lookup service is a special service that contains the topology information about the vSphere and enables the components to connect to each other securely. Since everything is basically talking to itself within this system, and we're not having to go out to a centralized authentication like Active Directory, the lookup service allows for the pieces to talk to each other more efficiently and more securely. It allows me to have multiple identity sources that can be checked and can be added to the token. We'll talk about the token a little bit later. And then there's a service called the SSPI service, Security Support Provider Interface. And the Security Support Provider Interface takes care of other authentication mechanisms. For example, NTLM and Kerberos. Can't forget about those, right? If we're on a network that requires that, right? Specifically, if we're doing things with Microsoft, a Microsoft Windows application programming interface, and those types of things have to be taken care of, then the Security Support Provider Interface takes care of that. So as you can see, there are multiple components that are in the single sign-on service that allow me to be able to, as a single sign-on administrator, in this case administrator of vSphere.local, to be able to come in here and be able to manage the system. And so next we'll take a look at the infrastructure so that you can see how all of this goes together and what happens when a user actually, and when I say user, of course, I'm talking about an administrative user, when a user actually logs on to the system. That's next.